So that gets us through that part. So now we're going to go through, unfortunately, the long drudgery of setting up preferences. Now, this again is something that you should go through with them on their own machines, on their own laptops. This can save them a world of hurt, but at any rate, I want to go through these things and talk about the decisions that we made, the implications that we made from all of that. So here inside of Lightroom, if you come up to the Lightroom drop-down menu and you come down to simply Preferences, we're going to start here. There's a series of tabs that run across the top. We're going to start with the one that says General. Inside the one that says General, the things that we are suggesting that people do in this. This is, right now, it looks to me like these have been set close to defaults, only because I'm not seeing any able to reset right here. So the splash screen at startup, it's just the picture of the girl with the glasses on. There's a new picture for the new one here. It's just a question of whether you want that or not. I would leave that on. I personally do not want to automatically check for updates. This is a problem that a lot of students are getting into because it's all of a sudden a thing pops up and says, oh, there's a new version, and they are just clicking on, yep, update, and that's where this mismatch of versions has caused us a world of hurt. So I'm going to suggest that you guys do not check automatic select for updates. In terms of the import options, the show import when a memory card is detected, there's debate about this because depending on where you are and the workflow that you use, some people prefer to have other programs activate when they put in a compact flash card. Primarily, and again, this is far more advanced than where we are talking right now, but I want, again, you guys to understand the decisions that we made and understand what is also happening here. For me, I'm primarily a Capture One user. I'm not primarily a Lightroom user. So when I insert a compact flash card, I prefer to have Capture One open as opposed to Lightroom. This is where these things get controlled. In our experience, it's better because students primarily are going to be working in Lightroom, that this is where you do actually have it checked. So that when they insert a compact flash card, if Lightroom is not open, it will actually launch Lightroom. But more importantly, if it is open like we've got set up right here, when they put that thing in, the import dialog box will open. The window for importing will open automatically in Lightroom. It's a step that they don't have to do. Does that sort of make sense? You can run into a problem with this, and you should just know about this. I'm going to jump out really quickly to the Finder. I want you guys to jump out here with me. I don't know if this still exists in the version of software that you guys have, but we'll find out right now. If you click on your application folder, there's another set of cataloging software that competes with this, and it's Apple software. So iPhotos or Photos Now, those are both Apple programs, competes with this. When you do a fresh install of one of those, of a new system from Apple, it is enabled that when you put in your compact flash card or you connect your camera, that Photos, or if you've got an old version of it, iPhoto launches automatically. You need to turn that behavior off. To do that, if you scroll, you would think that you could set that up in either Photos or iPhoto. You don't. You set it up in a program called Image Capture. It's right here. Do you guys have an Image Capture? Again, I don't know if it's still a version in the software that you guys double click on that to launch it. Now, we're not going to be able to get to this, but if you're experiencing this behavior, which means you put in a compact flash card and Photos launches, you want to put in your compact flash card, you want to launch this image capture, you will see the device right here. It will be sitting right under here. If you click on that device, you will get a pop-up menu that sits down here, or a pop-up item that sits down here, allowing you to turn that behavior off, saying that when you put in this compact flash card or connect your camera, that you do not want Photos to automatically launch. This is where it's dealt with. So if that then is set up, you can quit this program right now. We can go back into Lightroom and continue to configure this. So that's what this guy is all about. We discourage this select current or previous imports because, again, The way we are going to set this up is that every assignment's going to have its own import catalog. So this is, again, you don't want this on autopilot, not catalog, I'm sorry, old folder. Sorry.
Detail selections are in that PDF.
All of them are right here. Ignore camera generated folder names. We do want that part done. Most cameras now are not generating their own folders, but depending on how your students have it set up, what will happen is that they've built a folder in their camera to do their capturing to. That folder will actually get imported and it will create confusion because, again, it won't be following the naming convention or the folder structure that we've got going on here. We debated about this, treat JPEGs next to the raw file as separate photos. We decided to leave this off. Again, what we're looking for students to do is, and this will bring this up, it'll show it as a problem. It is possible to set your cameras up to shoot both a raw file and a JPEG now. If they do that, we don't want this to show up. What we only want to actually have show up in Lightroom is their raw photos. We don't want JPEGs next to it because unfortunately they can do a bunch of work on their if they don't realize that those two things are separate, they can do the work on their files on the wrong one. Instead of working on their raw file, they can work on the JPEG file. So we are leaving this unchecked. Replace embedded previews with the standard previews during idle time. It's just a time management thing. So when you shoot a raw file, in most cameras now, they generate a small JPEG to be the preview. That preview is not large enough for us to work on or to be really valuable to us in Lightroom. So we want to use the standard previews in Lightroom. So that's why we've got this part checked right here. I don't actually change any of the sound things here. It wouldn't really have a big impact on it a whole lot anyway. The next thing that we're going to go to is the presets right here. If you click on presets right here, there are a couple of things that are really critical for us here. It's interesting. They've changed now some of what's actually on this guy right here. But nonetheless, the important one is this right here. You want to check on this box right here, stores presets with the catalog. The reason that we are doing this is that when you get into doing things like building a preset for copyright, for instance, we can build, and we will build one, a preset for copyright, to add copyright when you're doing an import. You want that available to the catalog forever. If in the old days what ended up happening is that presets were saved in the system, they weren't saved in the catalog. That has now changed with this. This gives us the ability to actually store. The presets are stored with the catalog. So as you move your hard drive from one machine to another, the presets go with it because they didn't get stored in the system, they got stored in the catalog. So that's what's basically going on here. So we're going to leave that part checked. Then we are going to go to external editing. This is a biggie. And this is another one that we've had a huge amount of conversation about. So I fought and argued for this a lot. There are people here who are preferring to do different color spaces and different bit depths for their files. So we're going to just start at the top. For the file format, you have two options for this. So the file format, again, and this is for editing primarily, specifically in Photoshop. If you click on this drop-down menu, you have two options. You've got either a TIFF or a PSD. We suggested that people actually use the TIFF extension on this because you don't want Photoshop to be the only thing that can actually open this file if somebody develops it. So for instance, don't quote me on this, but I don't think Preview can open a PSD file, but it can open a TIFF file. So it's just a question of compatibility. There is no downside to using one of these over the other, so we are going to leave it as TIFF. In terms of the color space, this is a big debate here, but the color space that we've elected for, and it's going to happen, it happens throughout the entire digital department, this all the way up into advanced retouching, is to stay with Adobe RGB 1998. And the reason that we felt that this was imperative is that even though conceivably raw files can take advantage of the larger ProPhoto RGB space, ProPhoto is so large you have to use 16-bit to use it. The space is simply too big to be adequately described with 8 bits. So if you were to pick ProPhoto, you would have to pick 16-bit. That doubles your file size. We are already having issues with files being taking up too much space, processing time being too long. You double the file size, the processing time doubles as well. Yes.
Looking at personal use,
Yes.
like if I wanted to put a book together, Sonia, then ProPhoto and 16-bit would be better.
So here's the deal.
Yes.
Here's the deal. So when we talk about color space, what we were talking about is a three-dimensional space. How big is it? And ProPhoto has a couple things going for it, a couple things going against it. All these spaces are theoretical spaces. They're mathematical spaces. ProPhoto is so big, it actually extends beyond the range of human vision.
So it's information you don't see.
You can't see. However, mathematically, you can push your image data out there. So you can go into Photoshop, put a curve on there, and shove that data out into an area that can't be seen by human eyes.
So in a practical sense, it's not going to show up in a print.
The other thing, and this has been the promise forever, is that there is to date no monitor that's even remotely close to being able to show you ProPhoto. The best you can pretty much get right now is Adobe RGB, 100%.
So what about print-wise?
And same thing with PrintWise. It's even worse. PrintWise doesn't even get close to Adobe RGB. It's much, much closer to sRGB, which is a much smaller space. However, that's the reason that we're actually dealing with it here. So I can't talk you out of that. What I can say to you is, if you are this is the holy grail part that's been put out there by Adobe forever, is that one day there may be a monitor that can show you ProPhoto. I can tell you right now, the three people sitting in this little room right here are not going to live long enough to see that. Mm-hmm. Or if you do, chances are you can't afford it.
I think they're embarrassed that 1998 is in the name, and that's
possibly
years ago.
Yeah, possibly. You know? So at any rate, but anyway, you certainly can use it. But again, the space is so large, you have to have 16-bit. No, there isn't. So you can't see it, you can't print it, you can't do anything with it.
What about 16-bit versus 8-bit?
So again, you could have a 16-bit, and the advantage to a larger bit depth is that you've got a magnitude order of more tone and color to describe the same space.
But can you see it?
The thing is that what you see is, or what would ultimately end up happening, where you would pick this up, is if you were doing a really radical tonal correction that forced you to pull your tones or your colors that were very close to one another, so far apart that you actually could see the gap in between. So banding is basically what we're talking about.
So if you have a really bad file and you're trying to fix it, it might help.
What my suggestion was, and the reason that I don't get too caught up in this part, is that I do all of my heavy lifting on a raw file. The raw file has nothing to do with this. This is now editing out. This is now taking your raw data and cooking it, baking it into a TIFF or into a Photoshop file. All that really heavy tonal work that you should be doing either in Camera Raw or in Lightroom, not once you get it into Photoshop with a curve.
Yeah.
So, and if you really need to go back and do some really sort of serious other heavy lifting, you're better off going back in and working on your raw data than you are trying to do this in Photoshop. So the consequence of this becomes, do you want files that are twice the size? And my argument is that you don't need it. However, I want you guys to understand, again, the process to make that choice for yourself. So, but according to our workflow here, we are going to keep this as Adobe RGB in 8-bit. Resolution here is meaningless. It doesn't have anything to do with the file at all. It's strictly the size it'll be. It's basically the size the pixels will be. It doesn't add any pixels. It doesn't subtract any pixels. It doesn't change the resolution of your file. It's just mapping how big those pixels are. It's a meaningless thing. You don't need to get into it at all. If for some reason you wanted an alternative, you could also set up your additional external editor as TIFF in ProPhoto in 16-bit so that you've always got the option to actually have that part with it. Here, the stack with original, we are actually enabling this. We do want to keep this part on. Here, we are not doing a custom naming, an external naming file part right here, because to be perfectly honest with you, and this is yet to be worked out, in Photo Practice 1 and Photo Practice 2, and guys, we'll take a break here really quick in just a second. I'm sorry, we got started a little bit late, but I want to get through the preferences, and then we'll take a break. And what we are hoping to do is that we are hoping to use a smart object workflow so that when we are bringing material out of Lightroom into Photoshop, we are not baking that file. We are not creating it as a TIFF and bringing it in that way. So this whole naming convention down here on the bottom doesn't really matter. To be perfectly honest with you, this whole dialog setup right here doesn't really matter as long as we are working in a smart object workflow. Some people are going to embrace that. Some people are going to reject that. So if they embrace it, this external editing doesn't really matter as much. If they reject it, then it does matter that we've got this guy set up the way we've got this set up. If you want to look at it at the end, we'll see what your time looks like at the end of today. If you want to get a quick taste of what that's like, I'll be happy to show that guy to you. Okay, next thing over, file handling. If we click over here in file handling, we are leaving this as DNG, the file extension for this, the compatibility. All of this you can pretty much leave as the defaults that are in here. We are using the JPEG. We are going to leave this as medium. We are going to leave it as a fast load version of this. These have all been changes that have happened in Lightroom to compete with much faster programs like Capture One, but I'm just throwing that out there. You definitely want to leave this two things over here checked because the problem is that what people are doing is that they are using, a lot of this has to do with illegal characters and how they are treated. Now, Macintosh file system is very forgiving in this. So you can use a lot of what are considered to be illegal characters in a naming convention of a file. However, there's a lot of systems that reject this categorically. Unix systems are notorious for this. So the problem that you run into with this, if you're strictly working on your laptop with a hard drive, it's not that bad of a deal. But when you want to upload a file to a server, say you're working on your website and you want to upload one of your images to your Squarespace website, it will reject the file because it's got illegal characters in it. I've run into this problem like you cannot believe. Because again, in the work that I typically do, it's nothing for me to upload 5,000 files at one time to do something overnight. And if any one of them has an illegal character in it, it will be rejected and the whole upload gets rejected. So it's just how these things are treated. In the drop-down menu here, I don't know what the default is here, but what I'm going to show you is in this drop-down menu right here, you want to pick the big set that you actually want to be killed. We are saying that you want to replace illegal characters with underscores. You'll see you can do it with dashes or but anyway, underscores is what we pick to do this. And then when a file name has a space in it, again, spaces are fine in a Macintosh world, but they are illegal in a Unix world. They're actually illegal in an older system of Windows world. So if you have a space in a file name, it will reject the file. It will not see it as something that conforms to its naming convention. Again, current Windows, like Windows 10 now, Windows 8, has pretty much gotten away from that. But if you have somebody who's working in an XP world, there's real hardcore restrictions about that, and spaces are not allowed in names. So just something to actually be aware of. So that's what we've got going on set up here. For the interface, if we click on this guy, what we are leaving here, we are doing this pretty much at its defaults for the panels here. However, we did change the font size here to be large just because it gives you a little bit more screen legibility. This is actually going to be in your notes. So the PDF you've got, I'm going to talk about it in here really quick. The default for the screen color in here is black, and that's what we suggest leaving it as. However, if you click on this drop-down menu, you'll see you can change it. Chris does a little bit different version of it here, and it's just something for you guys to be aware of. You may want to sort of embrace this. He changes his to white. And the reason he changes it to white is that he finds that when kids are actually developing their files here in Lightroom and they are trying to essentially adjust a highlight point, that having a white reference gives them something to balance that against. So when they're looking at their image and they're trying to set the highlight point, how bright that should basically be, they have a white reference that's around it, and it is the surround, it is the interface of Lightroom. Does that sort of make sense? I think that that's a little more confusing personally, and that's also slightly troubling in that that white surround becomes then the color also of your eyes automatically adjust to the brightest thing in any given scene. And so your eyes are adjusting to the color of the interface, and that can cause you to feel like your file has color cast in it or a perversion in it. So it's just something to be aware of.
Or
About
darker
light
lighter.
gray.
You could pick a light gray again. So this is pretty much up to you. We're leaving it as black. It's the default. If you feel really compelled to change it, you could actually, again, I don't think you would find a whole lot of people. Those aren't the things that are going to bite you later on. I just wanted to bring that part up. The note about that exists in the PDF so that you can actually go through and read that. In terms of the keywording entry, again, I think most of this is at defaults. We use commas to be the separators between keywords. Spaces, I think, is again a poor choice of something. The reason that that is that you can have keywords. If you leave it as spaces, let's say you, anyway, commas are just the easier thing in keywording to actually denote different keywords as far as that part goes. In terms of the film strip part down here, I don't know if you guys use badges if you work on any of this stuff. We don't. So we've left this at its defaults just so that you understand that. And then again, the tweaks, this is more just how the interface part works. All of this we've actually left at its defaults. And that is getting us through, I think. We can touch bases really quickly. If you look at performance really fast, this is not in the PDF, but I'll show it to you just so that you know. This is pretty much gone away now as a problem. However, if you've got a student who's working on a laptop that's, say, circa 2007, this can be a problem. So I don't know if you guys had any experience with this at all, but have you ever been working in Photoshop? This would, again, happen primarily, a whole lot more so, probably 2 or 3, 4 years ago, whatever, where you were working on a Photoshop file and all of a sudden you got either big white blocks or big black blocks on your image. So it would literally be an image that looked like this, and then all of a sudden you would have a gigantic black box that was right here, or a whole string of them. That was caused by incompatibility between graphics accelerations, the cards that were actually in those computers, and the graphic accelerators. So this software is designed to leverage your video card that's inside of here. If the video card is too old, this can cause those problems. If that's happening, this is how you undo it. You would uncheck this use graphic processor. The rest of this you can pretty much leave at its defaults. We bumped up the cache size for a faster read from the old version because most people are working on terabyte hard drives now or larger. If you had a hard drive that only had 120 gigabytes on it, you might want to trim this part down. And then the rest we can pretty much leave as it is. The Lightroom sync part, we are not using this at all. This is where you can actually sync your photos to your Lightroom application on your phone. Again, this is so much more advanced than I think you guys want to get into. This is just not an area that I would want to actually get in and work on. And then network is actually in the same issue right here. You can use proxy servers with this. This is way, way, way more advanced than you want to get into. So why don't we do a quick break? Are you guys up for that? I mean, there's only 3 of us, or do you want to soldier on?
Wherever you're at.
I could go on.
Okay, well then we're going to go on. You can close this up now. This part's been set. We still have some settings that we need to deal with though. So again, back up to the Lightroom catalog, back up to the Lightroom menu down to catalog settings. This next guy will open up. Again, it's got a series of tabs that run across the top. So in the general setting right here, we're going to leave this in terms of where the information is located. It should be by default in the catalog. However, this backup we are going to change, and this is a critical one right here. Instead of doing this once a week when exiting Lightroom, you want to change this to never. The reason this exists is that this is not, when the word backup goes out, most people think that, well, I'm backing up all of my Lightroom catalog, my raw files, I'm backing up everything. It's a protection for me, right?
It takes like 5 seconds, so what is it actually doing?
What it's doing is it's only backing up the database. It's not backing up your raw files.
Right.
And we felt like that was misleading because I think you look at this and you
Because it's,
say,
in other words, the preference settings.
exactly. That's it. The only thing that gets backed up is that one little light. This is what gets backed up. It does this. If you look in again at this thing that we've made, it's this file right here. This guy is the only thing that is backed up. And it's backed up actually in a completely different spot on your computer. That's where it goes. So it doesn't even stay on your hard drive. So unless you know where this thing is, it's meaningless to you, or I mean, you have to be working on your own one. So at any rate, we discourage that because what we felt like, and I think this is something that you should encourage, is this entire Lightroom library folder should be being backed up because it contains everything. It contains that database file, but it also contains all of your raw files. So you have a true backup.
What do you think is the best way to back that up since it's dynamic and it's always changing?
We'll talk about that at the end of this as well. I'll show you a couple of things that just make a little note to make sure that we get to that part so I can make sure that I answer it for you. But at any rate, that's why we have changed this in the catalog setting because again, I think that this is a false sense of security here. We're going to go to file handling next. In the file handling, this is now changed a little bit. So this is one of the things that did get updated. The screenshots for this now are all for version 7, or not the latest version of Lightroom, but the one that we are suggesting everybody use. Is it 7.5? Yeah, I can see what one this is. Yeah, 7.5. Okay, so in this drop-down menu in the file handling here, this is now changed to, in your possible drop-downs right here, this is the size for your standard previews that are going to be rendered. We are leaving this at auto now. It's actually, you can override this and say that you want smaller ones or large ones. This auto, what it does is it actually looks at the computer that you're working on and it sets it to the resolution of your computer screen. So if you're working on a 30-inch monitor, your standard previews are going to be larger. If you're working on an 11-inch MacBook Air, they're going to be smaller. So auto we felt was fine. The preview quality, again, they're all JPEG, so this has to do with the compression. We thought that medium would be fine on this. And then the automatic discard, we've actually changed this. We've updated this to 30 days now. And the reason we did that was that, again, most students now have got hard drives that are large enough that they can carry this sort of overhead baggage without really a huge hit to them. It used to be that they were having these previews discarded after one day. That doesn't really give students time to actually, they import their work. If they don't do all the work that they're going to do on it on that day, then the standard preview gets discarded and it has to be rebuilt again for them to do the work. That seemed to us to be really onerous. That takes more time. You're not really saving anything. So the 30-day preview discard seemed to make sense to us. Again, that doesn't mean a student can't work on their file after 30 days. It just means that at day 31, when they go to open a file to develop it, it's going to generate the preview again for them. So that's all that part was about. The import number sequence here. So this is a really esoteric thing. You would think that there's no reason to actually have it set up like this, but there really is a reason to have this set up like this. So the analogy that I try to make with this is that let's say you get hired to copy a Gutenberg Bible. And so you set up your lights. This is my Gutenberg Bible right here, right? You set up your lights. This is the cover of the book. And I set up my lights. I've got my camera on my monopod. It's looking down at this guy. And I take a picture of the cover of the book, and everything's great. And then I open the book, And for page 2, I have to move either the book over or my camera over and change my lighting and shoot page 2. And then to shoot page 3, I've either got to move the book or go back up and move my camera. That's a nightmare. So instead, you can change the import number sequence here. Instead of 1, you change it to 2. And what will happen is every file you shoot, it will be every other one. So what you can do is you shoot page 1, then you shoot page 3, then you shoot page 5, and the import sequence will match. So you shoot all of the left side or right hand pages of the book first, and then you go back in and you shoot all the left hand. And you change your start number. Again, the first group, the odd group, will be starting with 1, and your second group will be starting with 2. And then your imports will all be in order. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it sounds like you're talking about copying a book.
It's what this is designed for.
So that has nothing
So
to do with
that's only
anything
if you're doing the systematic kind of left-right.
What you're trying to do is you want every other file imported in every other file's order. You don't want to import the way it was shot. You want every other one.
But that's only applicable in very
It's
specific
very, I'm
instances.
just showing you what this is here.
Okay,
Because if they change this, all of a sudden they're going to be, their files will not be in the order that they shot them in.
okay.
Okay,
So we leave it.
yes,
Long story short.
yes,
Okay.
yes, leave it, sorry.
Okay.
Metadata, the last thing that we're actually going to get to right here. And in metadata, what we've actually done, and this is a biggie right here, the defaults are to offer suggestions for recently entered values. That all part makes sense to us. That seemed to be smart. To include the developed settings in the metadata. So in any JPEG Photoshop file or TIFF or PNG that you create in Lightroom, all of the metadata is embedded in those files automatically. However, the one thing that's not here and the one thing that we are strongly suggesting is this, to check this automatically write changes into the XMP file. Now, what's going to happen is if we did not have this checked and we were to import, do an import, which we're going to do in just a second, when you went in and you looked at your camera raw files at the folder, we would go back into the Finder. We would open up this camera raw file right here. If we did not have that checked, all you would have in here would be your camera raw files. That would be it, period. However, by checking that, what ends up happening is there is an XMP file or a sidecar file that is written for every single one of those imports. And the reason that file, that XMP file, is important for us is twofold. Number one, well, let me ask you this, guy. This is my trick question, the only one I'll throw at you today, all day, I promise, I think. Can you name a program that will edit a raw file? Photoshop, people say Photoshop, people say Canon software, if you're shooting Canon, Nikon. The truth of the matter is you cannot edit a raw file. You can process one, but you can't actually go in and edit a raw file by design. So what happened was Adobe is actually, this is another one, Adobe money grab.
If you work on it, it actually saves it as a different file. The raw file stays the same.
What I'm saying is this. When Adobe first came out, Adobe, they were the pioneers of actually building the format for a digital file. And every single digital file that you have is actually an Adobe file. So all NEFs, if you're a Nikon shooter, those are actually TIFFs that Adobe has licensed to Nikon. What a TIFF allowed them to do, though, there's a little header in there that says that Nikon can put in its proprietary software that makes it a Nikon file so that nothing else can read it. Well, Lightroom can read it, Nikon can, but it's a proprietary Nikon file. It's the exact same format for Canon. Canon just put in their little special code that makes it a Canon. Exact same file for Sony, exact same file for Phase 1. Everybody's raw file is actually a TIFF file. When you buy a camera, part of the price that you pay on that camera is royalty that goes to Adobe. So every raw file that you shoot, every one, Adobe's paid for it.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
insane.
Yeah.
It's a part of the price of the camera. What they do, I think this is what they do. Don't quote me on this because nobody will talk about it. I think what they do is they look at the life of a camera and figure out how many exposures it could really make. and they pay Adobe based on that number.
Isn't capitalism great?
Oh, it's crazy. But at any rate, the reason that I bring this up is that, so that was the first thing that happened. So Adobe felt like they satisfied that part, that they could supply it to everybody, but then the law enforcement came along and said, well, this is all great and fine and well, whatever, but we will never use a digital camera because you can alter the file. I can put my head on your body. You're killing him. You're committing murder. I can put my face on it, whatever. All of a sudden, I'm the one committing the murder, right? So law enforcement said, absolutely not. We will not, nope, we're not going to use digital. It is a non-starter. And Adobe came back to them and said, we will lock the raw file format down so tight that if anybody goes in and changes one thing in it, it will corrupt the file and ruin the file. You won't be able to open the file. So that is the consequence. This is what has led us to where we're at today. You cannot edit a raw file. There's no software that's made. There's no illegal software. If you can get inside of a raw file, but if you change anything in it, it corrupts the file to the point that it's unreadable. It self-destructs.
Oh,
But you
that's
can work on a raw file.
yeah,
You
but
can.
that's all the setup.
You
Say it
can.
differently then? Is that
So this is what happens. So when you work on a raw file, so you're in Lightroom and you do all sorts of developing. You make it, you change its saturation, you change the exposure, you do all of those things to it. You cannot save those changes back to the raw file. So instead what happens is they create what's called a sidecar file. It is an XMP file. It is a secondary file that sits right next to your raw file that says, this is how he developed it.
changes?
Exactly.
I
So the
explain
original
it,
file
yeah,
is still there.
it's there.
It is.
I explain it as like that everything you do, that's the recipe.
Exactly.
And that the raw file is the, raw ingredients and so you can apply the recipe.
Yes.
But you're not, but then
It's
the
still
next
in
time
that
you
same-
open it, you've still got the raw ingredients and the recipe.
Exactly.
And they seem like they've combined to cook it,
Right.
but really, you
Two
can just,
separate things
you
in
can
one
just
file.
remove the recipe and the raw ingredients, like go right back to exactly.
Right. So what happens in Lightroom is if you don't actually say that you want to generate this XMP sidecar file, Lightroom remembers all the development changes that you've done for every file. That's what's actually written into the database of Lightroom, along with all the history states and everything else.
But if you send it somewhere else, it won't recognize those changes.
Exactly. So if you send your raw file by itself, you give it to me, all I have is the raw file. I don't have any of that information. If you give me the raw file and the sidecar file, the XMP, I get everything. And so the reason this becomes important to us too is twofold. Number one, if your database crashes or is corrupted, your XMP files will regenerate all of that database information. So when you go to import Lightroom, it will all the work that you've done gets brought in. But even better, if you somehow screw up and you upgrade your Lightroom catalog and you want to downgrade it, you can simply import, again, the raw files with the XMP next to it into an older version of Lightroom, and it will rebuild all of that XMP data for you. So you don't lose any of the work that you've done, which we felt was really critical. There's a downside to this. The downside to this is, again, you're now littering that camera file with, for every file that you bring in, there's now two files. There's the raw file and the sidecar file.
But aren't the sidecars really small?
They're incredibly small. They're like literally 1K.
So it's not a big.
And no, it's not a big. It's just a lot more. It's if they're importing 50 files, they actually have 100 files. It's just more files. But unless they're really looking at it, that shouldn't be that much of an issue. But does that sort of make sense?
Totally.
Okay. So again, that was an important one for us that was not turned on by default. And then the rest of this, we don't get into the automatic face detection part. We don't get into any of that part. We can, sort of be done with all of that.